I've been building my dream home and homestead from scratch for way too long, and I'm learning all new trades along the way, from tree felling to running an excavator, doing the foundation, framing my home, learning how to roof, install windows, siding, electrical, plumbing, HVAC, and so much more. And this week, I'm doing a time-lapse recap of the framing series from start to finish. If you're new here, I post a weekly vlog of my DIY build, mostly every Sunday morning. So if you're into that, subscribe, smash the like button, and let's get started.
Today is framing day. I was so excited to get started on framing my home. I had no prior experience to this other than building the shed on our property, which my stepdad helped me build, but I mainly watched videos online on YouTube and just followed my plans.
Here goes cut number 1 for our entire house.
In my area within Canada, we have to frame our exterior walls with 2x6s for the R value and for the snow loads. I started with the base plate. This was required to be pressure treated for the exterior walls, even though there's going to be sill gasket in between. And then I measured out where my anchor bolts were going to be, and I got that fitted in place first, which was a lot trickier than I thought it was going to be.
Okay, there we go.
After that, I took the top and bottom plates of this wall and drew out where each stud was going to be, whether it was a regular stud, king stud, jack stud, cripple stud for the window opening. And then I got to cutting all of the studs, and yes, they forgot to send me my 92 and 5/8 length studs, so I had to cut them all. These are the wall partitions. I started nailing them together first, and then I nailed together the headers, which I was not supposed to build them this way. I found it in a framing book and I was wrong. Look at this little trick I learned with bowed base plates. I started nailing the base plates with galvanized nails as is required in my area, and bit by bit I was nailing my first wall together of my dream home. And then I realized my first mistake was making my jack studs too long, so I cut those 1.5 inches shorter, forgot to subtract the base plate from the measurements. Just like that, I was finished framing the first wall and onto the second wall, which was the exact same design, just reversed. So I matched up the top and bottom plates with my previous wall and got to framing. There's only so much that research can do when you decide to go and build a home. Sometimes you just have to dive in and go, okay, I gotta do this, and if I make mistakes, that's okay. And that has been this entire journey for me. And for the things I got wrong, like making box headers, instead of laminating my headers together and nailing them together, I just ended up having to rip them out on a later date once my inspector caught that I had done something wrong. On the weekend, my hubby helped by cutting the studs on my cut list so that the next day I was able to come back and start working on the next walls. I was on a bit of a time crunch, thinking that I could get my home framed up in 2 weeks before our wall raising party. This is obviously more than enough time for a crew to come in and do it, but when you're predominantly working alone, it definitely was not enough time to get it done. Now that my first 3 walls are built, it's time to square up the walls and start sheathing them. I'm using OSB and I'm sheathing it horizontally as it crosses over more studs, and this way I can stagger the joints from the bottom row to the second row.
I'm back.
This is my stepdad, Craig, my stepped up dad, who has helped me learn so many different things in the trades, and we work so well together. I have to admit, I had him cutting the OSB for me while I nailed it in place, and we got a good flow and routine going. We got those first 3 walls sheathed, the windows cut out, and we started building the next walls. Because we're having a wall raising party, we're building one wall on top of the next so that we can raise all of our walls in one day. And that day ended so quickly, back to it alone.
Oh my gosh, the math for my cathedral walls. This has been keeping me up at night for like what feels like weeks. These 2 cathedral walls.
I eventually realized that the bulk of the math I wanted to do wasn't going to work, and that I was going to have to template my studs and figure out the lengths of them that way. These are most certainly the hardest walls I have ever built. I've never built a rake wall before, but eventually mapping it out worked really well, and I was able to lay the wall out. Next up, my husband was able to help me nail this whole beam together, which was so helpful. This beam is going to hold up the LVL that holds up our entire roof. Framing this wall brought brought me so much joy. It was such a learning curve, but I always find the harder the learning curve, the more rewarding it is to get the hang of. I decided to not sheet these walls because I wasn't sure how many people were going to show up to the wall raising party, and they were really heavy and tall to begin with. On to the next cathedral wall. I got started by doing the outline of the wall, and I did a little bit of templating, but I had to do a little bit of math to figure out where the stud was going to land at the very top. I didn't think I'd ever use the Pythagorean theorem after high school, but here we are. I was starting to feel the overwhelm that the wall raising party is tomorrow. Luckily, my husband got off of work early and was able to help me finish off the rest of this wall, and it really just started coming together. Oh my goodness. I have the window opening in place, the 6-ply stud pack that holds up the LVL beam, the LVL header, and the filler pieces for the triangle window. Now, I didn't quite make my goal in getting all of the walls framed at this point, but I had 7 walls framed, 2 of the hardest ones framed. I had 3 main walls left to frame and 2 small walls left to frame. That evening, my parents showed up with their trailers, so we had a bathroom for people to use. We sheathed more walls. We built 1 more wall. My mom helped clean up the job site, and then it was time for the wall raising party. Well, almost time. We were there hours before other people were, and we were able to hammer out 2 more small walls and get the other base plates ready to go so that I could frame the rest of the walls when the other ones were out of the way and stood up. Before we knew it, our friends and family were showing up for our party. I could not get over the immense support from all of my friends and family who decided to show up and be there for us that day. And there were so many people. I think we had 20 adults. A lot of them knew what they were doing too. So many people lifting up 1 wall, which is incredible because we're having to lift them up and over onto the anchor bolts, which makes it a little bit more difficult. At first, I kind of just stood back and watched it all happen. Watched the walls get lifted into place because there were so many people and everyone was so willing to help. But eventually there was enough space on the floor for me to start framing those last walls that needed to get into place. It was so wild how quickly it went too. I think most of these walls were up within the first hour and a bit. And then we got on to the dream, the rake walls of the home. I've always wanted a great room that was vaulted, and seeing my designs come to fruition was just incredible. While I was getting the very last wall framed up, everyone is having a well-deserved pizza break before we got back to it. We carried 3 massive 38-foot long beams into the house, put the very last wall up, and I guess we started hand bombing these LVL beams, which I really don't love looking back on because I feel like there were so many other safe ways to do this. I wish we had more scaffolding. I wish the 1 rake wall was completely sheathed to make it stronger, but I do have to admit, these guys did it. They got it up. They were so impressive. We got that wall straightened back up and officially had the beginnings of a home. I'm so thankful for our friends and family who showed up for us. We would not have been able to do this without you. And I'm thankful for this dream because without my dream, this wouldn't have happened either. And I was officially back at it alone. I started by doing the double top plates, struggled, and moved on to trying to do the OSB. And I struggled again. And then I decided I probably should have a second person here to try to sheathe the house. So I moved on to some of the things I could do, like nailing the studs together of the walls that were just put up, adding insulation into the wall partitions. I forgot to add some insulation on some of the walls, so I had to pull out those studs and add the insulation and put the studs back in. And then thank goodness Craig came to my rescue. We put the double top plates up together. It was easier to do with a second person. Craig would push or pull the double top plate in to help straighten out the wall while I nailed it. And then we moved on to sheathing the house. We tried to get most of the OSB on the walls before the walls went up, but there were certain things like wanting the OSB to overlap any wall seams. Most of the walls were not built to full length. Like our 28-foot long wall was built in 2 sections because we had to lift a giant wall over top of these anchor bolts, so it was easier to do with smaller sections. This was definitely a 2-person job. I can't believe I ever thought I could do it on my own. I'm so thankful to Craig, and now I'm back at it on my own, cutting open the window openings because, oh my gosh, you just have to look at this window. Isn't that amazing? I got the rest of those window openings cut open, and I finished up cutting the remainder of the little OSB pieces for this wall. And then on the weekend, our daughter had a play date over, and so my husband and I were able to get some uninterrupted work done and got the house wrap on the house. Then it was time to start my interior load-bearing walls. Obviously, they're load-bearing, so they have to be done before the roof rafters or the trusses are installed. Since this section was going to be, again, 28 feet, and I wasn't sure how many people were going to be able to help me lift them into place, I built them into 3 sections. I don't know if you noticed my little chainsaw wedges hanging around while I'm framing. I absolutely loved using them to lift up a little piece of a stud so that I didn't have to hold it into place. It was really helpful when the studs were a little bit janky. With the first section of load-bearing walls done, my husband was able to help me on the weekend lift these into place, securing that end stud to the wall partition, and then using a ramset gun for the first time. This was quite the experience and so hard to use.
Holy that hurts. Whoa!
And of course, making sure I wasn't going to hit any of the in-floor heating lines. Time for the next 2 walls, and officially one side of the load-bearing walls are done. I started laying out the next load-bearing walls while my husband cut the studs for me. And once he was done that, I was moving on to nailing the walls together. He was going around the house and taping the vapor barrier to the double top plate. And then it was time to lift the walls that were going to make our kitchen and our living room. Here's the thing though, it ended up not looking good. You could see a hump at the top of the framing because of a hump in the concrete. So I decided to take it down and ask my concrete guy to come back and grind down the hump in the concrete. There was a lot that went wrong on our concrete pour day, just with the temperature and the concrete setting way too quickly. So he was going to come back and work on it on a later date. So I started working on the non-load bearing interior walls. This is where a lot of my domestic water lines and vent stacks were coming through the walls, and I had to cut them through the base plates. I love rewatching this wall footage because it was so tricky getting it on one side of the pipe and on the other side of the pipe, but I got it. One thing I will say as I'm framing these walls is I wish I had put up more bracing on the outside of the house, more bracing on the interior of the house, because it did get a little bit wonky when I started putting up these walls. It started pushing out the outside wall here, which eventually we kind of had to fix and put more bracing in. But it was really exciting seeing these walls come together, except for when I saw all of these doors that were going to be coming into our living room and kitchen. And on paper, it made sense, but in 3D in real life, it did not look good. We're walking into the guest bathroom here, and I decided I was going to put doors on either side here and create a little hallway here and shorten up the bathroom. So it's going to take 3 feet away from the bathroom, but it still left room for a vanity, and it was going to make this look a lot less like an apartment complex. I started by removing the headers and the jack studs and filling them in with studs. I love that I learned how to frame, that I've done the framing up to this point so that I didn't have to do a change order and have a framer redo their work, because that would cost so much more money. I did end up needing to get my plans revised and reapproved, but it was so well worth having this little hallway in here. Time to frame up the new bathroom wall, get that in place. And after I got that done, I thought about widening this door opening here, but I was so happy with the fixes so far. This is where Craig and I started straightening out some of these walls that started going out of plumb and adding in way more bracing. And the concrete got knocked down a bit, so we were able to put up these other load-bearing walls and move on to some of the non-load-bearing interior walls. Craig was also there that day to help with the window and door delivery. Once that was over, I was back at it alone, framing up the last of the interior walls. On to the maintenance room and entry room wall, and then I decided to take out this opening and make it bigger for a better entryway into the hallway and bedroom. And last but not least, the pantry and bathroom wall. And while I was working on that, Cam was working on a little bit of an issue with this wall being out of plumb. He was cutting out the nails and screws that were holding the LVL beam into place. And I had a plan of using ratchet straps and a come along in order to get this wall back into plumb. It wasn't really working at first. So we decided to work our way along and nail this LVL beam together because it hadn't been laminated yet. And our goal was to bring the scaffolding to the other end after nailing this together and cutting the LVL beam away from the studs again in order to get some movement so we could get these walls into plumb. We had both sides ratchet strapped and secured and started using the come along to try to bring these walls closer together.
Yeah, 100% moved all of this.
Did it?
Yeah.
No, it's moving the beam. It moved the beam.
Yeah.
I just watched the beam move.
That's crazy.
Getting these walls plumb was such a triumphant feeling. Now that everything was plumb and secured and the interior walls were done, I started working on the roof rafters. This took a little bit of trial and error and some math, some bird's mouths to figure out, but I finally got there, got the template going, and Cam and I were working at getting the roof rafters into place. I had to make sure that the roof rafters were tall enough to meet the truss roof at the exact same height because I wanted my roof lines to perfectly intersect at the top. Things were taking us so long because we were having to hand nail all of these nails in. So on Sunday, my mom and Craig came. My mom helped watch our daughter. Craig was cutting while I was nailing the plates on, and Cam was putting them in place and nailing them at the top. We had quite the assembly line going, which was great, but unfortunately, trusses were coming in 2 days. And this was taking so long. We did get a fair amount done, but I called and asked my neighbor Brian if he could come a little bit earlier. He was going to come help with the trusses on Tuesday and install them with his employee, but instead, he came Monday morning, and I said to him, people on YouTube keep commenting about how I need sill gasket underneath my interior walls. And he was like, yeah, you need that. And he came up with this incredible solution of cutting out the ram sets, jacking up the walls, and sliding sill gasket underneath my interior walls. I cannot believe I did not realize that sill gasket was required under interior walls of a concrete foundation. I would say this was probably one of my biggest mistakes. And without Brian's solution, I probably would have had to take everything down. So I'm really thankful for his brain. By the end of Monday, we got the rest of the roof rafters up, and Brian brought his rafter nailer, which sped things up so much. At this point, trusses were coming the next morning, and we needed plywood going up the rafter roof so that the trusses could climb up the rafter roof so that the roof lines could meet up. At this point, I was so terrified of heights, so I was really grateful for Brian's help with getting these trusses up. The trusses arrived, and I paid to get them craned into place to make the process a little bit smoother. While Brian was doing that, Craig was going around and planing the interior walls down that were a little bit too high because, again, the concrete had so many humps in it. And I was going around with Brian's rafter nailer and getting all the rafter ties nailed in. This day went so quickly, and I was so grateful for professional help in getting those trusses in. The next day, Brian came back, and it was my turn to help. I got to help him climb these trusses up the rafter roof. I swear I was terrified of heights before this day, but I eventually learned how to stand on the trusses, get my footings right so that I could actually be of help. I was a bit slow moving at first, but I eventually got there. I just want to say a huge shout out to men and women in the trades who are willing to teach. Brian took time out of his own schedule to not only throw these trusses up, but to teach me the process of it. Also, this is when we realized my math was right and my 2 roof lines were going to intersect properly.
Which is actually something a lot of carpenters don't know how not to up.
I spent a lot of time doing math on this.
If you look at a lot of roofs, this roof peak will be about 6 inches higher than most. Yeah.
Cam started nailing in the hurricane ties while Brian and I worked on the next roof line. These trusses climbing up the rafter roof were cut on a 45-degree angle to make them sit nicely onto the rafter roof. This was allowed because they're actually not considered structural once they're climbing up the other roof line. Look at it all, it's complete, and it's time to move on to doing the outriggers or the ladders that extend out past the gable end of the truss. My gable end was built 3.5 inches shorter than the rest of the trusses. This way you could put a 2x4 on its side in order to extend the roof line out further. And I had to build myself a little step to get to the top of the gable end. These outriggers help keep some of the precipitation away from the house, and I also think it makes it look a lot classier. Next, it was time to cut the LVL beam to length. I started with a scale saw and moved on with a chainsaw. And then I moved on on to doing the outriggers for the bump out feature wall. These outriggers went 2 rafters back and tied into the 3rd rafter. And oh my gosh, yay, I finally got a second set of hands to be able to start putting up the sub fascia. I could not get over how much the sub fascia really started making this look like a home. Time to do the next rake wall. We got the outriggers up and cut to size and cut the LVL beam down. First of all, look at how satisfying this is. And second of all, I wanted the sub fascia to be able to go seamlessly across the truss roof, up and then down the rake roof, and then across the truss roof again. I was so happy with how seamless this all looked. And then it was time to start putting plywood up on the roof. On the weekend, Cam helped me finish off this 12-12 pitch. 2 out of the 4 12-12 pitch roof lines. And then I was back on my own Monday morning, which meant I needed to have some ingenuity. I put the plywood up onto the scaffolding and then put it up onto the roof. And I had blocks there, making sure that the plywood wouldn't fall back to the ground. The first row was the trickiest, getting everything lined up and all of the trusses plumb. But after I got that first row started, it was smooth sailing from there. This is definitely something that I wanted to have help or to hire out, but trades are hired out so far in advance, almost a year in advance for a lot of these builds. And it's really hard to find someone to just come by and just sheet the roof, especially if you framed the house yourself. A lot of framers don't want to get into the difficulty of having to help someone on a project that might have been framed really poorly before they got there. So I trucked away at this predominantly alone, other than when Cam could help me with the other 12-12 pitches. Sheathing the roof took me just a little over 2 weeks. So you can definitely see how hiring someone out would be beneficial to just get it closed in and to get the ice and water shield on the roof. But I ended up being so proud of myself. I even did the 12-12 pitch alone, which is a little bit insane. But hey, overall, it was going to cost me $30,000 in labor to frame the entire house. So I was really grateful to save that money and to gain the experience. Cam was able to get off work a bit early and help me with the last strips. And officially, we were able to get the roof completely sheathed and able to move on to the next steps, which was sheathing the gable ends. Craig was able to come back and help me with this. We got into a groove. He was on the ground cutting, making sure it would fit the spots and end on a stud. And I was up there nailing away. Then we got to the sub fascia, which, oh my gosh, I cannot get over how much it makes it look like a home. And we finished off with stapling and taping the house wrap. Back at it alone, I decided to finish off the sub fascia on that side because Craig and I didn't get to finishing off this side. Once I got one half of the sub fascia up, I put that same half of house wrap up, moved the scaffolding over, got the rest of the sub fascia and house wrap up, and was done. I got Cam back on a weekend to help me finish up the sub fascia on this front bump out feature wall. This is such a huge feature of the home, having it seamlessly waterfall down. And then I realized I was having a bit of an issue with this post. When I went to go cut out the sliding doors, I guess the base plate was warped a bit. So when the base plate was cut out for the sliding doors, this post was floating a 1/2 inch. So I decided to jack up that LVL beam in order to get that post floating again, to shove a piece of steel underneath that my inspector approved. I later tapconned that little base plate to the concrete, and then I decided to add long GRKs into the post, staggered every 6 inches because the post was starting to separate, meaning there wasn't enough nails in it. This was a great fix. It's held up, and I've been really happy with it. The GRKs really added strength and stability to this post. Next up, it was time to do the peak over my front door. This obviously keeps snow and rain off your head when you're entering your doorway. It originally was supposed to be a truss peak that was held up by posts that went into the earth using a sonotube foundation. I really didn't like this because I have an engineered floating slab, and I was worried that if the house were to heave, these posts wouldn't heave and that it would cause cracking or damage in between the 2 roof lines because of the 2 foundation types. So I went with this cantilever approach. At first, I tried doing a 6-12 pitch above the door, but that did not look good against the 12-12 pitch peak right beside it. So I opted to try it again and go for a 12-12 pitch. This looked so good and I loved the size of it. The original plans almost doubled the size of this front entrance peak, and I liked the smaller size a lot better. Now this all ended up being a very good idea, but the issue was I never got approval from my architect or from my township. I just didn't think anyone would care, and so I ended up failing it at inspection. My architect had to come out, see what I built, redraw it. He made a few changes, like using bolts instead of GRKs to secure it to the wall, and I got those plans reapproved. After getting the little rafters and the subfascia up, I put up the plywood and finished off the little peak over our front door. I just want to say a huge thank you for watching this video of mine, a massive recap of framing my home from scratch. I'm so thankful for all the friends and family who helped and for all of you who have watched along the way. Again, if you haven't yet, subscribe. It's a huge help to me and my family. Thank you for being here, and I'll see you next week with a regular vlog of my builds.